I met him online almost 3 years ago. At the time, I was spending way too much time in random Discord servers, mostly gaming communities. Nothing special, just places where people joined voice chat after school or work, played Minecraft, talked about their lives, and slowly became familiar voices in each other's evenings. Some people stayed for a week and disappeared. Some people became regulars. And some people made such a strong first impression that everyone noticed them immediately. Daniel was one of those people. The first time I heard him, he sounded confident. Not loud, not annoying, just very comfortable in conversation. He always knew what to say. If the call got awkward, he could fix it. If people were quiet, he'd start a story. If someone sounded down, he suddenly turned into this weird mix of therapist and older brother. That kind of personality works really well online, especially in a server full of people who are mostly bored, slightly awkward, and just looking for something to do at night. At first, he was just another guy in the group. Then, very quickly, he became the center of it. It wasn't forced either. That's what made it believable. He didn't beg for attention. He just naturally got it. One night, he'd join and casually mention that he had just gotten back from another country. Another night, he'd talk about some online business deal he was working on. Sometimes he'd give relationship advice, like he had already lived through 10 different versions of adulthood. He always sounded experienced, like he was only a few years older than the rest of us, but somehow already far ahead. And I think that's exactly why people liked listening to him. Most of us were still trying to figure life out. School, work, future, relationships, all of it felt messy. Daniel always sounded like someone who had already crossed that messy part and came back with answers. So naturally, people listened. At first, nothing about him seemed suspicious. He played games with us, he stayed up late, he complained about normal things, he joked around. If anything, he felt more real because he wasn't trying too hard to seem impressive. That's what made the lies work. They were wrapped inside normal conversations. He never entered a call saying, "Hey everyone, I'm rich and successful." Instead, it was always more subtle. Someone would ask how his day went, and he'd say something like, "Pretty stressful, had a long client call." Someone else would ask what kind of work he did, and he'd answer vaguely, mostly online stuff, business, clients, investments, that kind of thing. That answer was just specific enough to sound real and just vague enough to avoid details. At the time, nobody questioned it. Why would we? It's the internet. People come from different places, different backgrounds, different lives. If someone sounds believable, you usually just accept what they say and move on. That's exactly what we did. Over the next few months, Daniel became one of the most active people in the server. There was a group of maybe 6 or 7 of us who were always around. Not everyone knew each other in real life. Most of us only knew each other through voice calls, games, and messages. But after enough hours, that doesn't really matter. You start recognizing people's moods from the way they say hello. You know who is more talkative late at night. You know who gets quiet when they're upset. You know who's likely to join if you ping the group and say, "Anyone on?" Daniel was part of that. He was there for random late-night Minecraft sessions. He was there for stupid arguments about movies. He was there for the weird personal conversations that only happen online between people who have technically never met but still somehow know too much about each other.
And over time, he kept building this image of himself. He had traveled a lot, he had lived in different places, he had worked with different people. He had experience in things the rest of us didn't understand yet. According to him, he had already gone through the phase we were in. He made mistakes earlier, he learned lessons earlier, he figured things out earlier. He made himself sound like proof that life eventually gets easier. And people like that. I like that too, at first, because when you're stuck in your own confusion, someone confident feels reassuring. It feels good to believe that somebody actually knows what they're doing. But slowly, very slowly, little things started feeling off. Not enough to call him out, not enough to even really talk about, just small inconsistencies. The first one I remember was about school. We were in a voice call pretty late one evening, just doing random things in Minecraft, mining, building, half paying attention. Someone asked Daniel where he had studied. He paused for a second, then said something like, "I mostly did things online." That answer was strange, but not strange enough to matter. A few days later, the subject came up again. This time, someone asked what he studied, and his answer was completely different. The first time, it sounded like he barely went through formal education. The second time, he described something that sounded much more structured. Someone in the call even joked about it. Daniel laughed and said he probably explained it badly the first time. Everybody moved on. That's how these things go. The first lie usually survives because nobody wants to make the conversation awkward. Nobody wants to be the person who says, "Wait, that doesn't match what you said before." Not in a casual gaming server. So the conversation always moves forward, and the liar learns something important. He learns that confidence is enough, that if he speaks smoothly, people will let the contradiction pass. That's exactly what happened with Daniel. Over time, I started noticing more things. He'd mention living alone one week, then casually talk about hearing his parents arguing in the next room another week. He'd say he had been in one country for years, then describe moving around constantly. He'd talk about earning really good money, then complain about things that didn't make sense if that were true. Individually, none of these things meant much. Together, they created a quiet feeling that the person we knew didn't fully exist. But again, no one said anything. And honestly, I understand why. When someone lies in small pieces, it's harder to react. A huge, obvious lie gets tension immediately. But small lies just create uncertainty. You start wondering if you misheard something. Maybe he explained it badly. Maybe you remembered wrong. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation. That uncertainty protects the lie. Daniel was very good at living inside that uncertainty. Then one night, everything fell apart. It wasn't a dramatic setup. It started like a completely normal call. A few of us were playing Minecraft, just building and talking, half focused on the game. Daniel joined later than usual. The first thing I noticed was that he sounded stressed. Not fake stressed either, actually tense. Someone asked if he was okay. He sighed and said he had just finished a really long work meeting. That led to more questions. What kind of meeting? What was the problem? Was it about clients again? Daniel started telling this story about a major business issue he was handling. It was one of his most dramatic stories yet. He described investors, deadlines, contracts, big decisions, the kind of things that made him sound less like some random online friend and more like some young businessman living a double life. At first, everyone listened like usual. Then one of the guys in the call asked a simple question. "How old are you again?" Daniel had answered that question before, more than once. Usually he made himself sound around 24 or 25. Old enough to explain the experience, old enough for the stories to make sense. This time, he hesitated. A long pause. Then he said 19. No one spoke for a second. The silence in the call was immediate. Not because 19 is weird, because it didn't match anything else. One person laughed a little and said, "Wait, what?" Daniel tried to act like nothing happened, but now people were paying attention in a different way. Someone asked, "Didn't you say you were like 25? He laughed awkwardly and said something like, "I mean, around there. I usually just say older online." That answer made things worse, not better, because now people were curious. Real curiosity, not casual curiosity. The kind that only appears when something suddenly doesn't make sense. Another person asked where he actually lived. Daniel answered, but that answer didn't match a story he had told before about moving. Then someone asked about university. That answer didn't match either. Then someone asked about his job, and that's when it really started falling apart. The more people asked, the more obvious it became that his entire online identity had been built out of exaggeration, not just one or two lies, a pattern. The online business? Mostly fake. The travel stories? At least partly fake. The living alone story? Fake. The age? He had been lying about that too. And because all those details were connected, once one piece broke, the whole thing broke with it. Within maybe 15 minutes, everyone in the call had the same realization. We didn't know this guy at all, not really.
We knew a version of him, a better version, an older version, a more impressive version, and he had built it on purpose. The mood in the call changed completely. Nobody was joking anymore. Nobody was playing normally anymore. The game was still running in the background, but nobody cared. One person finally asked the question everybody was thinking. Why would you lie about all that? Daniel went quiet. For the first time since I had known him, he didn't have an immediate answer. No story, no joke, no smooth way out, just silence. Then, finally, he said something that surprised me. I didn't think anyone would notice. That answer was so honest that it made everything feel even stranger, because he didn't deny it. He didn't try to fight it. He just admitted it. A little later, he added something else. I just didn't want to seem boring. And that sentence changed the way I saw everything, because suddenly it all made sense. The advice, the confidence, the dramatic stories, the perfect timing and conversations, it wasn't confidence at all. It was insecurity dressed up as certainty. He didn't want to seem ordinary. He didn't want to be the youngest one, or the least experienced one, or the guy who was still figuring things out like everyone else. So he invented a version of himself that seemed further ahead. And he stayed inside that version for so long that maybe even he started believing parts of it. That night didn't end with a big fight. That's what made it weird. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation. No one cursed him out and left. The call just slowly died. One by one, people disconnected, and the server never felt the same again. Over the next few days, Daniel still joined a couple of times, but everything was different. Before that night, people listened to him. After that night, every story sounded suspicious. Every sentence felt like it might have another layer. Trust had disappeared. And once that happens, it's almost impossible to rebuild in an online space.
Because online, people only know what you show them. And if what you showed them turns out to be fake, there isn't much left to stand on. I think Daniel felt that too. At first, he tried acting normal. He joined and talked like usual. But now, people questioned the little things. Not aggressively, just differently. The energy was gone. He wasn't the center of the server anymore. He was the guy who lied. And I don't think he knew how to survive that version of himself. So he slowly stopped showing up. Less calls, fewer messages, longer gaps between appearances. Then, eventually, he left the server completely. No goodbye, no final explanation, nothing. Just gone. At first, I was mostly annoyed. Not angry in some huge emotional way, just disappointed. Because I had actually liked him. Not the fake version, the version I thought was real. And realizing that so much of it had been made up felt embarrassing too. I wasn't just disappointed in him, I felt stupid for believing him. That part stayed with me longer than I expected. Because once you realize someone lied to you repeatedly, you start replaying every conversation in your head. You start wondering which parts were real. Did he actually mean any of the advice he gave? Were any of the vulnerable moments honest? Did he ever actually trust us? Or was the whole thing just performance? And the truth is, I still don't know. That's one of the weirdest things about online friendships. They can feel very real. And they are real, in a way. The conversations happened, the time happened, the laughs were real in the moment. But the person on the other side can still be hiding huge parts of themselves. The internet makes that easy. You can rebuild yourself with words. You can choose what details to reveal. You can edit your identity until it sounds more impressive than your real life. A different age, a different job, a different level of confidence. And if you do it well enough, people believe you. Especially if what you're offering people is something they want. Confidence, advice, interesting stories, a version of adulthood that seems certain. I think that's why Daniel's lies worked so well. He didn't lie about random things. He lied about becoming the kind of person everyone else wanted to believe existed, someone who had already figured it out. But the older I get, the more I realize something simple. People who really know who they are usually don't need to create larger versions of themselves. That need comes from insecurity, from feeling small, or late, or ordinary in a way that feels unbearable.
And honestly, that part made me feel sorry for him, because underneath all the lies was probably just someone who hated how normal he felt. Someone who thought the truth about himself wasn't enough. That's sad in a way, but it's also dangerous, because insecurity doesn't excuse deception, especially when you build trust on top of it. I think the thing that stayed with me the most was not the fact that he lied, it was how easily it all worked. How simple it was to create a completely different identity just by speaking confidently and avoiding details. It made me much more careful after that. Not paranoid, just more aware. Now, when someone online seems too polished, too perfect, too strangely ahead of everyone else, I pay attention differently. Because real people are usually messy. Real lives are inconsistent in normal ways, but not in those perfectly self-protective ways liars often are. Real confidence usually has humility in it. People who are actually doing well don't need to remind everyone constantly. That whole experience changed the way I look at online friendships. Not in a cynical way. I still think people can build real friendships online. I've seen that happen. I've lived it. But now I understand that online closeness can sometimes make you forget how little you actually know. You might know someone's voice. You might know their habits. You might know what time they usually log on. You might even know their fears, their relationship problems, the things they say late at night when everyone gets honest. And still, you might not know them at all. That's the strange part. You can spend hundreds of hours talking to someone and still be talking mostly to the version they want you to see. And sometimes the version they want you to see is built entirely out of lies. I haven't heard from Daniel in a long time, not directly. Once, maybe 6 months later, I saw his username in another server. I don't know if it was really him or just an old account reappearing somewhere. I didn't message him. I didn't feel the need to, because by that point, I understood something important. Whatever friendship we had was built on an image, and once that image broke, there wasn't enough truth underneath it to rebuild from. Sometimes people online don't leave because of conflict. Sometimes they leave because being seen clearly becomes impossible for them. And maybe that's what happened with Daniel. Maybe after the lies were exposed, he couldn't stay in a place where everyone knew the real version was smaller, younger, and far less impressive than the one he had invented. Maybe disappearing felt easier than being ordinary in front of people who had once admired him. If that's true, then honestly, that's kind of tragic, because in the end, no one actually hated the truth. If he had joined the server as a normal 19-year-old student from the beginning, nobody would have cared. Nobody needed him to be rich or experienced or older or successful. We would have talked to him anyway, played games anyway, laughed anyway. The lies didn't make him more likable, they just made him more fragile. Because the bigger the fake image becomes, the more terrifying it is to lose it. And eventually, you always lose it. That's the thing about lies built over time. They don't usually collapse because of one genius investigation. They collapse because the liar eventually forgets which version of the story they told. And once people notice one crack, they start seeing all of them. That's exactly what happened. One wrong age, one wrong answer, one pause too long, and suddenly the whole identity fell apart in a single call. I still think about that sometimes. Not because I miss him, more because it taught me something real. Most people aren't lying because they want to manipulate everyone. Sometimes they're lying because they think the real version of themselves won't be enough. And that makes them dangerous in a very quiet way. Not because they're evil, because they're scared. Scared that if people see them clearly, they'll disappear into the background. So they become a character instead. Older, smarter, more successful, more certain. Anything except ordinary. But ordinary is not the worst thing in the world. In fact, I trust ordinary people much more now. The ones who say, yeah, I'm still figuring things out. The ones who admit confusion. The ones who don't act like life is already solved. Those people feel real.
and real is worth more than impressive. So if there's any lesson in that whole experience, it's this. When someone online seems too perfect, too put together, too consistently impressive, there's usually something underneath that performance. And if the whole thing feels slightly off, trust that feeling. Because sometimes the weird feeling is the truth arriving before the proof does. And sometimes the person who lies about everything isn't trying to become someone else. They're just trying to escape being themselves. But once you see that, it becomes impossible to listen the same way again.